Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my March wrap-up. March flew by and was like a really weird reading month for me, but I got a lot more read than I thought that I was going to, so let's get into it. Also, I'm using a new mic, like an external mic, because a lot of you have said, and I know that the sound in this room is not great, so you let me know if this sounds better. I will know once I start editing it, but you also let me know what your thoughts are. Hopefully it's better, fingers crossed. I completed 7 books in March and DNF'd 1. I'll just talk about my DNF really quick. It was The Luminaries by Susan Dennard at about 70 pages when this book is not very long. So the fact that I couldn't really push through it, I think says something. But this is the first book in a YA modern fantasy, like contemporary fantasy duology. It has a lot of elements that I thought I was going to really like mystical woods where monsters pop up and they're monster hunters and whatever. But this was written so juvenile to me. Like, this was definitely very young YA, where her other series, the Witchland series, is very much like an older YA series in my opinion, and just is more elevated than this. And so I did not resonate with this. There's this whole that really sticks out to me. So there's whole clan naming system where everyone takes the last name of the day of the week that they go hunting on, but none of them are like related really. Like, it's like a whole thing. There's just a lot of very juvenile tropey things going on. I could not care less. So as much as this is a beautiful cover and the story sounds like something that would resonate with me, very much didn't. So DNF to this one. So the first book I actually finished in March was Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. I am rereading the books in the Expanse series, which is a series that I've already read, so I think I've read the first 3, so that I can continue with the rest of the series, of which there are 8 or 9. So this is the first book. It primarily follows Holden, who is Captain James Holden. He's the captain of this ship that gets involved in this kind of conspiracy-ish thing where his ship, that's just an ice-carrying ship, gets attacked. This is in the far future where we have colonized all the way out to like Saturn and Pluto and whatever, like the asteroid belt. We've colonized the asteroid belt. There are people colonizing Mars. There's all of these like different people, and there's all of these interplanetary politics. And so this crew is just like a ragtag crew that brings ice from Saturn's rings back, and their ship somehow gets stuck in the situation, gets destroyed, and so they get pulled into this like crazy plot of like political things and whatever. Meanwhile, there is Detective Miller, who is an asteroid belt police officer detective basically, and he gets tasked with trying to find this like missing woman, and there's also this like weird virus thing that's gotten released. So this is just the start of the series, which is very long, very epic sci-fi series, and we're following both of those characters. I remembered a lot of this first book more so than the next 2 in the series that I forgot a lot of for some reason. I think because I read them primarily in like 2019 and 2020 when my brain was not soaking up information. But this one I read earlier than that, so I remembered a lot of it. I liked it much more on reread. Keep in mind there are triggers in here for some really juicy body horror and mentions of rape and things. So this is a little bit heavier in some of the descriptions than I even remember, but I really dug this. I'm glad to be back in this world. This was a solid 4 stars. When I first read it, it was like a 3.5. I found more to like about it this time around. Probably now that having been in the world a little bit longer, it was just kind of nostalgic to reread. So looking forward to continuing with this series. Then I read The Last Graduate by Naomi Novik. This is the second book in the Scholomance series, which is an adult fantasy series that takes place in a magical school where everyone sends their children because magical kids are a attractant to these mouths, they're basically called. It's these monsters of all different types. They'll basically eat children for their mana, for their power. And so the safer option is to send them to the Scholomance, which is this magical school that basically trains them / tries to kill them, but it's safer there and monsters are there too. It's safer there than out in the real world. So that's what the first book was about. Can't talk much about the second book because it would spoil a lot of the first book, but I've done a spoiler-free review for this book if you're interested in my thoughts on it. I didn't like this one quite as much as the first one. It felt a little bit filler to me. Much more world-building stuff. I mean, the world-building in this series is pretty heavy, and I like the world-building, but I wish we would have gotten a little bit more of some of the character stuff. I continue to like the characters, and I didn't think it was at all bad, and what it's setting up for the final book I think will be really interesting, but this wasn't just quite as strong for me as the first book was, so I gave this one still a 4 out of 5 stars. There are continued triggers in here for gore and body horror, but if you read the first book, you probably know that. But yeah, there were parts at the beginning that kind of dragged a little bit, and it just felt like a lot of world building for a second book. We just got a lot more than even the first, and the first was pretty heavy world building, but I still enjoyed it. I think part of the fun of this series is the world building. So overall, I plan on finishing with this series 4 out of 5 stars. Then surprisingly, I read Serpent and Dove by Shelby Marin. This is a book I've had on many a TBR. I actually did a spoiler-free review for this as well. A lot of you thought that I'd already read it because I've mentioned it so many times about being skeptical about reading it. But this is the first book in a YA fantasy trilogy that follows a witch and a witch hunter, and things happen that make them need to get married in sort of like an arranged marriage thing. She knows he's a witch hunter. He does not know that she's a witch, and there's a lot of political machinations. It's taking place in sort of like a fantasy France, and she is running from everything, her past, all this stuff, and the witchcraft in here is like very dark, so there's a lot going on with that. But people really talk about it for the romance. I ended up kind of enjoying this in a cotton candy read kind of way. I flew through this. I actually enjoyed the world. The first little part of it I wasn't sure about because she uses a lot of like French words as world building, and I find that really annoying. But she stops doing that like pretty soon into the story. And then the actual magic of the witches I found really cool. So it is darker. There are triggers in here for self-harm, scars, and blood. So there's a use of sort of like blood magic. There's a use of if you're doing kind of magic, you need to have given something, make some kind of sacrifice yourself in order to get the magical thing. But I tend to like when there's a trade-off with magic. I think that works really well and is really cool. And I just liked the witches and like their powers and machinations with them and all of that. I liked the romance just fine. I think it could have actually been a little bit more slow burn for how much hype there is around this being like an enemies to lovers slow burn. It could have been way slower burn than it was. But it was still enjoyable. I still pulled for them, but I don't know if it's going to pull me through 3 books of a series. But this first one was enjoyable for me. I think like a 3.75, and I do plan to continue, but I'm not like super invested in if the second book does not live up to, I don't know, just the fun of this, then I will DNF it. Then I read The Parable of the Sower by Octavia E. Butler. I listened to this on audio. This is the first book, or I think it's a duology. The first book in a sci-fi, like near future apocalyptic duology. It follows the main character who is part of a almost like cult-like evangelical part of society. In actually supposed to be like 2024, but this was written, I think, in the 90s. So in a near future now, you know, where things are really going to shit, the world is not safe, society is kind of collapsing, and very much like late stage capitalism and all of this. And we're following her. She has different beliefs that aren't based around any different kind of religion, where she really wants to like leave Earth, and she feels like Earth is like, we should be done with it. And this really, oddly enough, I didn't really know what I was getting into when I got into this. I just know Octavia E. Butler is like very well loved in the sci-fi community. This was much more pre/during apocalyptic. Didn't really feel very sci-fi. There's elements of sci-fi in that our main character can also like feel other people's, like experience other people's pain in a way that is like, it's like a science ability kind of, but this is much more of a slice of life journey than anything really epic. It's much more of this like day-to-day, them having to form their own way, having to build community, lots of really messy stuff happens. There are trigger warnings in here for fire, rape, death of children, just death in general, like animal abuse and stuff, sexism, and some pedophilia. We're basically following these people as they're trying to like forge a life and like have hope. And then the second book seems like it might get slightly more sci-fi. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue with this. This was just fine for me. I could definitely see Octavia Butler like as a good author, but this kind of just like slice of lifey sci-fi that is this like, I don't know, it's just very dark and sad, and like in the same vein as like a Margaret Atwood and some of those, where you're just kind of like, this looks like really realistic and I just can't, like, I don't know. There's pieces of hope, but I don't know if it's quite enough for me. So this was fine. Again, I can see the writing skill here, but I give about like a 3.5, much more sort of theme and quiet character work focus than I was necessarily expecting. Then it was Shift-a-thon, so I ended up finishing 2 books during Shift-a-thon. The first was Blue Moon by Laurel K. Hamilton, a continued reread for me for the Anita Blake series. This is book 8 or 9, I think. I'm just kind of losing track of the numbers when we're getting this high. And this is a continuation of a lot of the building of the meta plot, of the character stuff, introducing new characters, introducing much more of the erotica elements are popping more into this. I've mentioned it before, but this is a series that starts out as very much urban fantasy, some like supernatural police procedural type vibes, and as the series goes on, gets much more erotica focused. And the erotica is like pulled into the magic, basically. It's like part of the magic system. We're not quite to the part where it gets like to be the whole plot, but we're moving towards it. So this one was like not my favorite of all of them, just because I feel like it's a little bit messy. There's like so many things going on and so many elements being brought in a way that was just a little bit overwhelming. This one's also super dark. There's trigger warnings in here for rape, gore, possession, and lots of body horror. Like, the Anita Blake series is probably, of all the urban fantasies that I've read, the closest to horror. So it's just fine. 3 stars for me. Enjoyable just because I have nostalgia for this series and I like these characters and whatever, but nothing, like, not my favorite of all the installments and things. But I will continue to read the series. And then next I read Magic Bleeds by Alana Andrews. This is the 4th book in the Kate Daniels series, which is another urban fantasy series that follows Kate Daniels, who is part of, again, sort of like a magical police force-ish, but she also used to be a mercenary, and she's gotten very, very involved in this fantasy Atlanta where sometimes tech is up and like sciencey stuff and technology works, and sometimes magic is up, and that's when like all the magical stuff happens, and there's werewolves and shifters and vampires and necromancers and different mythological creatures and everything. But she's gotten pulled into all of these supernatural politics of this world, and this is a continuation of that. So again, we usually have some kind of like mystery story that is now tying into the meta plot of sort of like the big bad that Kate will eventually have to fight, and so we're getting much more of these connections. This one was really fun. We also got a really big step forward in the romance element here, which was really enjoyable because it's these 2 idiots who have a really hard time falling in love with each other and just need to communicate, but they're both stubborn dum-dums, and I love them. So this was very fun. 4 out of 5 stars. And lastly, this month I read The Sword of Kigen by M.L. Wang. This one was our House Help Book Club pick for this month, so there is already a live show up that we did recently, so I will link that on the screen for more of my in-depth thoughts. But this is this is so hard to kind of explain, actually. This is a self-published fantasy novel that it's a standalone, but it's kind of a part of a series. Like, it's almost companion-y, but you don't have to have read the series. I didn't, but I'll talk about that in a second. And this is kind of based on almost like a feudal Japan, like an Asian-inspired setting, a East Asian kind of inspired setting, but it's also modern day. Like, they have tech and stuff, and it's not our world. It's like a different world. It's all very kind of confusing, but we're following this one family, primarily this woman and then her teenage son, as the son is discovering more things about like this empire and that not everything is exactly as he thinks it is. She knows that, but is in a place where she can't necessarily talk about it. She has this more violent past that is not allowed because now she's a housewife and she's supposed to be a mom. So a very like structured society, and we just kind of follow them for a portion of their lives and how this ties into the greater world. This is also darker. There are trigger warnings here for rape, death of a child, war, and just sexism and misogyny within this culture. This was a bit too long. Definitely a book that you can tell is self-published and that it really did need more of a heavy edit. And like I mentioned, it's advertised as a standalone. Everyone tends to read it as a standalone, but there are so many elements of the plot here that tie into some like greater world thing, and so there's a lot of things that are left sort of unfinished. The series that this is kind of a part of or like adjacent to is actually a series that this author is not continuing with, so I'm not even sure some of these things will get answered. But this definitely didn't feel like its own thing. Like, it definitely felt like a component of something, which is what it was. But before I got into it, it was very much advertised as a standalone. So it dragged a bit at the beginning, and there were some characters like more than others. The character work, though, I do think is really excellent, especially in the second half. There was some really cool character stuff. There was some skillful writing there and some themes there, but ultimately this just felt like, again, a sort of like slice of life in a very military fantasy setting without it quite being a military fantasy. People talk about like being a military fantasy. I wouldn't quite call it that because you're not quite getting those elements that I expect from a military fantasy. We do have this sort of like a Avatar Last Airbender type magic system, honestly, which is fun, but there's a lot of world building soup here. Just like a lot of elements, a lot of info dumping and all of that, but the actual character work And some of the plot pieces were interesting, and some of the writing pieces are interesting. I think there's a lot of potential there for this author to grow, especially if they were to actually have like an editor and a team behind them. But this was just like kind of fine for me. I ended up giving it like a 3.5 stars, I think, and that's mostly for the end and some of the character work at the end that I thought was really cool. But overall, not as polished as I was expecting for like a award winner. So this was good, but I'm not quite sure I understand like the overwhelming amount of hype around this one. But that is it for all that I read in March. So comment below and let me know what you read in March or if you have any thoughts about some of these books. Thank you all for watching and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye.